Okay, this is video number 8 on the differences between the base game and LecMod. This video is going to be a bit longer, a bit more in-depth, because the subject it deals with is a bit more complex. I'm referring to great people generation and use, which is substantially different in LecMod than the base game. Essentially, in the base game, you had this problem where you had three of your main great people: great merchants, great engineers, great scientists, and they were all tied to the same generation mechanism. Essentially, you had a timer where you generated merchants, scientists, and engineers sequentially, essentially, so that every time you generated a scientist, engineer, or merchant, it would increase the cost of the next scientist, engineer, or merchant by 100 points. And that'd be on standard speed, 67 speed on quick speed. Now the problem with this was that compared to scientists, merchants and engineers were trash, especially merchants. Scientists were so much stronger because science was so just crucial to that base sort of part of Civ. Scientists were so much stronger that really you didn't want to generate an engineer or merchant at all. You just wanted to play the entire game without generating any if you could. And this sort of created this balance problem that was one of the first things addressed by LecMod. Now the generation of scientists, engineers, and merchants are separated, so that when you generate a scientist, you do not increase the cost of your engineers and merchants, and vice versa. So if you can see here, I've generated so far one scientist, so my next one is costing 134. I've generated one engineer, so my next cost is 134. I have not yet generated a merchant, so you can see that the cost for my first merchant there is 67 if you see on the tooltip. So generating my engineer and scientist did not increase the cost of my merchant. So it is perfectly fine for me to sort of work a market slot here and generate a merchant, because I'm not depriving myself of my scientists or engineers by doing this. That was really the negative of generating merchants before. It's not that merchants were bad per se. It's that it was the opportunity cost. You were giving up scientists and engineers by generating a merchant. That was why you had people, for example, who would hate it when they built Colossus and Great Lighthouse, because they would end up accidentally generating a merchant. And this was terrible, because it cost you a scientist, essentially. So now the way things work is essentially, it's good to generate all kinds of great people. Normally how this plays out in the actual game is maybe you have one city that works a merchant slot that generates merchants. Maybe later in the game you work bank and stock exchange slots. But generally you don't prioritize rushing merchants unless you're really doing a strategy based around gold, like a commerce strategy or patronage strategy. Engineers, people usually have one or two cities that are working engineer slots, at least to start, and then maybe later 4 or 5. Because usually what they have is they have a workshop that's working a specialist, plus wonders that have engineer points on them, like pyramids. With this change in the generation of great people, wonders that have great people's points on them, especially engineering points, become a lot more valuable. So wonders like Chichen, pyramids, Stonehenge, Hanging Gardens. Before, it was kind of, you didn't really care about the engineer points. Engineers weren't bad, but you didn't really want an engineer. So the engineer point on Hanging Gardens, it was not really a major benefit to building the wonder. Now, all of a sudden, because of the value of engineers, because they're no longer costing you scientists, they're just getting you a free wonder, essentially. People love these engineer points. they make a point of stacking the various engineering wonders on each other to get more engineers. So that's been a change in the value of the wonders. Part 2 relates to a change in wonders specifically, and policies as well, with how they deal with great people. Previously, you had a wonder like Globe Theatre, which says you get one free great writer when you finish this wonder. And this was a lie. You did not get a free great writer, you got an immediate great writer. So for example, I've generated one writer so far. My next cost is 134. In the base game, if I were to build Globe Theatre right now, my cost for my future writers would actually go up if I built it. That is, I wouldn't get a free writer, I would get an immediate writer. So I'd get my next writer at this next cost, 134 points. But I wouldn't be free. This is a change in LecMod. Now, anything that says in the base game you get a free great person, that great person is actually free. So, Brandenburg, for example, does not give you... if Brandenburg gives you a free great general, Fizzy gives you a free great artist. What other free great people are there? There are free great people in the aesthetics tree. You get a writer here, an artist here. And then anywhere where it doesn't say you get a free great person, like with the patronage tree, for example, or with the Mayan great people with their unique ability, those great people are not free. They're immediate. They give you the great person immediately and increase the cost for your next one. So again, this kind of changes the mentality with respect to things like this, because before it was quite difficult to say go for tourism, because if you rushed for a wonder like Globe Theatre or Uffizi, you were essentially delaying your later writers and artists, because the artists and writers you were getting were not actually free. They were just immediate. Also, some great people have been removed from certain wonders. The free great person for Pisa has been removed. It doesn't really matter. That's still one of the best wonders in the game. The free great scientist from Porcelain Tower has been removed, and the two great scientists from Hubble Space Telescope has been removed. Hubble has a bit of a different function now. So those are the great people that have been removed from the wonders. But in general, for all the other wonders, they now give you truly free great people, rather than immediate great people. There's essentially no opportunity cost, which is a benefit, and it's more clear in the sort of the text of the game. The third major change to great people is the most significant. It's been maybe one of the big shifts in general gameplay, and one of the big influencers of how gameplay has evolved within the LecMod versus the base game. And that is, of course, Great Scientist Yield. The way it works in the base game is a scientist is worth your last 5.5 turns of science generation on quick speed. Now, the important thing to note there is that it's your last 5.5 turns. It is a changing number. It's got a changing yield. So what would happen is, if you generated say you generated a scientist before your public schools, like I have just now. I just generated this scientist. If I held this scientist until I finished my public schools, then its yield would go up, because I'd be generating all this extra science. So what people did is, in the base game, they held their scientists, all the scientists they generated, right until they finished plastics, and then they would wait 6 turns and then bulb them all to get deep into the information area. That gameplay is gone, because now scientist yield is based on the last 5.5 turns when the scientist spawned. This yield will never change. This will never increase. This is as much as it's going to yield me right now. How does this change the strategy? Well, it changes it in a million different ways, really. Because science is, again, I've said this before, is just so core of a base mechanic in Civ. What do you do with your scientists now that they no longer increase in value? Well, basically, you bulb them. My general rule is as long as the yield is above 700, I just bulb them. Because the short-term benefits you get from bulbing immediately outweigh the long-term benefits of planting them. Because I could plant this and it would be 8 yield modified by 83% of my capital, so that's about 14.5 yield. It would take 100 turns for me to pay that off right now. Better to just bulb it immediately. It wouldn't actually, because I'd get a boost to the yield of scientific theory, and I get a boost to the yield of plastics, but it would take 70 or 80 turns to pay this off, versus bulbing it now. So that's a very clear, better option, is just to bulb it now instead of plant it. And bulb it now really instead of wait. Because unless I'm uncertain about what the optimal tech path is, I'd rather just get industrialization immediately. I want my factories, I want my ideology. I want to be building my public schools with my factories already up. The other thing to note is that there isn't really a benefit to waiting to generate your scientists. This might seem counterintuitive, because previously people waited until after plastics to bulb their scientists. So wouldn't you want to wait to generate scientists until later in the game, until they're more valuable? No, basically. Because it goes back to what I've mentioned before about opportunity cost. The value of bulbing that scientist, it's a bit shy of 1,500. That's what its value is in the actual beakers you get. But I'm also getting to my public schools 5.5 turns faster now. Which means I get all that extra science. It's going to be like another 150 science for public schools. Plus the scientist generation I get from them. That scientist might have bulbed for 1,500. But really, it's giving me much, much more. Probably triple or quadruple that in the actual science I gain. Because of the increased yield I'll get from my public schools, and because of the increased generation I'll get from my public schools. And I'm also getting, because I'm getting to my public schools earlier, I'm also getting to my research labs faster. In fact, I'd argue that when people were playing the base game and saving their scientists, they were playing poorly. They did not realize what they were doing with their scientists, that they were essentially waiting too long to bulb their scientists, because they could have gotten more immediate gains that would have snowballed into long-term gains. It used to be pretty common to get to research labs. This was before the mod. Playing in NQ, it used to be pretty common to get to research labs turn 150. Now it's pretty common to get to the research labs before turn 120. Even as we've had nerfs to other aspects of science in the game. That's the sort of snowball effect that is in part driven by this changes to the scientist mechanic. So what does that actually mean in terms of strategy for beginners? How do you manage your scientists? For more experienced players, it'd be a bit different, because there are some subtleties. But in general, I think it's a good idea, as soon as you get your universities, start working the slots if you can. I think I'm working all my slots except for 2. Yes, I'm working all my slots except for 2. Because the benefit is here, you get the immediate science yield. It's 8 science to work these 2 slots. That's pretty decent just by itself. but it's really the scientist generation. Because I'm not going to get this scientist in 9 turns, really. At least not in this city I will. In Guangzhou, I won't get this scientist in 10 turns. But this will be a scientist I generate probably either just before labs or just after labs. So I'm setting up to generate the scientist, in 20, 30 turns. And you essentially want your cities to always be generating scientists, because if the game's going to go long enough, you're going to need them. You need to have that constant generation so that you do end up generating, if the game goes long enough, your 9th, 10th, 11th, maybe even 12th scientist. Usually the only time I don't work my slots is if I'm trying to get a city to grow a bit more. Like, this city's pretty weak, it's pretty low in production, it needs help. I don't really want to starve it of another growth or production tile to work a university slot when I've got 7 other cities doing that. Or if there's if I've just had a specific increase in science, for example, if I just built my public schools, I maybe want to wait another extra turn or 2 to generate my next scientist, just to increase the yield a bit. If you watch me in videos on working scientist slots after just getting to public schools or just getting to research labs, that's what I'm doing. I'm essentially delaying my scientist spawn a few turns, just so that I get those extra few turns of yield increase, of generation increased, before I spawn my scientist. Because remember, it's like your scientist yield is the last 5.5 turns of science. So that's the general principle with scientists. You want to generate them pretty much immediately, as soon as you can, and then you want to bulb them pretty much as soon as you can. There are some exceptions, but for beginners, I would keep to those principles. It's a simplified way of thinking of it, yes, but it's also generally the correct play. So if you sort of are unsure of what to do, work your scientist slots, bulb your scientists, worry about the rest later. When I'm unsure of what to do in a game, that's what I do. For beginners, that's a pretty simple way to approach it. In general, with great people, you want to be thinking, you've got something here, it's a very useful tool, it's a great person list, that you can see how many turns where you're generating certain great people, how many points you're getting per turn, how many turns are left. You want to generally be keeping an eye on this, so that you can see, okay, when's my next writer? When's my next artist? When's my next engineer? And you can plan things around that. So, for example, I've got a great engineer that's coming in 16 turns. So, I'm not going to be able to engineer, say, Taj Mahal, Porcelain Tower. That's going to be out of the question. I'm not going to have an engineer for that time. But if I build my factory, work my factory slots, I might have an engineer for something like, Pentagon, or Christo, or something a little later in the tree. Kremlin, probably, if I'm going order here in a game, which I would probably do in a real game. And I haven't really touched on writers and artists because they're not really changed from the base game. But writers and artists are obviously just as important as the base game. Arguably more so because of the stronger culture in general. I like to generate artists and writers usually after I get to universities. So after I have my universities up, that's usually when I'll build my guilds, start generating artists and writers. I usually split my artist slots, my 2 guilds, just because it's a lot of lost production and food to work both of them in the same city. But I had a pretty strong cap here for Liberty Cap, so I ended up doing them both in my main city. That more or less covers it. This is a sort of more complicated subject. I've done a very simplified approach, but something that should be easy for newer players to understand. If you have questions about this, just leave a comment. I think I get to most every comment that people leave, because again, the purpose of this all is to help players get better. That's pretty much the sum purpose of it, because it's better to play with better players.